The land stretched wide and unforgiving beneath the Arizona sun, a desert plain broken only by mesquite shadows and distant ridges that bled red against the fading horizon, and Daniel Harlow, a rancher hardened by years of solitude and sorrow, leaned on the weather-beaten fence post of his corral as if it were the last anchor tying him to the world, his eyes fixed far beyond where the cattle grazed lazily in the dry grass, far beyond the trail that wound its way like a serpent toward the distant mountains, his thoughts dwelling on memories that seemed to claw at him whenever the sky burned gold at dusk, the memory of brothers lost in the war, the memory of his young wife lowered into the cold earth after a fever swept through without mercy, and the memory of laughter that had once filled this ranch but now was as absent as rain in summer. He had grown used to silence, to the creak of the windmill and the soft whinny of horses as the only voices left to him, and in that silence he found both comfort and a kind of punishment, for the West had taught him that a man could survive alone but he could not truly live without others to remind him that his heart still beat for a reason. It was during such an evening, when the desert light turned everything into fire and shadow, that he heard it. A sound so faint he might have dismissed it as the trick of wind-stirring brush, yet his instincts, sharpened by years on the frontier, told him otherwise, and his hand went to the Colt revolver at his hip even before his head turned toward the mesquite stand at the edge of his land, where the branches shivered though no breeze touched them, and then she came forth, stumbling yet swift, a figure so unexpected and fragile that Daniel did not draw his gun but only stood still, watching as a young Apache girl, no more than 17 perhaps, emerged from the thorny embrace of the desert, her bare feet cut and bleeding, her long dark braids undone and tangled with dust, her simple cotton dress torn at the shoulder as if she had run through thorns and rocks for miles without rest. Her face was proud, set with the strength of her people, yet her eyes betrayed both fear and exhaustion, two black pools that burned with something desperate, and when she saw Daniel by the fence she froze, her chest heaving, her lips trembling as if the English words she tried to summon would not come easily, and when at last she spoke her voice was raw, accented, halting, yet carried by an urgency that could not be mistaken. "I need men to go on living," she said, one hand pressed against her chest as though steadying the life inside her. "My people, gone, my family, gone, I, alone, if no one help. I die," and in that moment Daniel felt time slow around him, for though the desert around them remained vast and merciless, the plea of this girl, spoken with such broken honesty, struck deeper than the silence that had long ruled his ranch, and he found himself torn between caution. Knowing too well the tensions between settlers and Apache, knowing how quickly blood had been spilled in these lands, and a compassion he had tried so long to bury that now it rose like a flood he could not stop, she swayed where she stood, her knees buckling from fatigue, and without thinking Daniel dropped from the fence and caught her in his arms before she crumpled into the dust, feeling how light she was, as though the desert had already begun to strip her of all but spirit, and he looked down at her face, streaked with dirt yet still carrying the delicate features of youth, and he muttered low, his voice gravel yet steady, "You'll stay, no one should die alone in this land," words that bound him to her fate more than he realized, for in saying them he had opened a door that could not be shut, a door through which storms, enemies, and changes would soon come. The girl's dark eyes, heavy with exhaustion, fluttered open at his words, and though she did not smile nor thank him, she gave the faintest nod, the Apache way of sealing trust without admitting vulnerability, and then her body went limp against him, unconscious from the strain of her flight. Daniel carried her into the ranch house, a sturdy structure of pine logs and adobe plaster he had built with his own hands years before, and laid her on the narrow cot that once belonged to his brother. When they had worked this land together, covering her with a wool blanket worn from winters but still warm. Outside, the desert shifted from gold to indigo, coyotes beginning their mournful howls, yet inside the ranch house a new silence took hold, a silence charged with the weight of decision, for Daniel knew that in sheltering an Apache girl he had taken a path that might bring the wrath of both settlers, who distrusted her people, and her own kin, if any survived, who might view his protection with suspicion. Still, as he lit a lantern and sat in his wooden chair watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, he felt something stir within him he had not felt in years, a purpose not born of cattle or fences or survival, but of responsibility to another soul who needed him not as a rancher but as a man who had known loss and yet chose to give life a chance. Hours passed until finally, near midnight, the girl stirred, her eyes flickering open in the soft glow of the lantern, and she whispered her name, Ayana, meaning eternal blossom, before closing them again, her lips parched, her body trembling, and Daniel fetched a tin cup of water, raising her head gently so she could drink, the water spilling slightly but enough to wet her throat. She drank greedily at first, then slowly, and when she looked at him afterward, those obsidian eyes were softer. Filled with a mixture of wariness and fragile trust, Daniel asked no questions that night, for he knew better than to pry into wounds still bleeding, but in his mind the questions burned nonetheless. What had happened to her people, who had taken her family, why she had crossed miles of hostile desert alone, and what dangers might now be following in her shadow. As dawn crept across the plains the next day, painting the land in hues of silver and rose, Ayana rose from the cot weak but determined, insisting on helping with chores, though her body shook with fatigue, and Daniel, though reluctant, allowed her to gather eggs from the chicken coop and carry water from the well, watching as she moved with a quiet dignity, her every gesture revealing the resilience of her heritage, and though she spoke little, her silence carried meaning, a language of presence that filled the emptiness of the ranch with something new. That morning, while Daniel repaired a section of fencing, he caught sight of her standing at the edge of the corral, her gaze fixed on the horizon, and he realized she was not merely surviving but listening, watching, feeling the land in ways settlers often ignored, and when he approached she said softly, "They come." Soon, her words chilling him with the weight of prophecy, though she did not say whether it was her people or enemies who would appear. In that moment Daniel understood that the choice he had made by letting her stay was no small matter, for the desert never allowed secrets to lie still for long, and whatever had driven Ayana to his ranch would soon come pounding at his gates, whether in the form of settlers, soldiers, or Apache warriors demanding answers. But as he stood beside her, the rising sun casting long shadows, he felt no regret, only a solemn acceptance that his life of silence was over, and that the story of a rancher and an Apache girl had just begun, a story carved not in comfort but in the harsh, unyielding beauty of the Wild West, where survival was not just about enduring the desert but about finding someone worth enduring it with, and though neither spoke of it aloud, both knew that their fates were now intertwined in a way that could never again be untangled. For he had given her a place to stay and she had given him a reason to fight again, and in the heart of the desert, that was enough to begin everything that would follow.